I'll start with you, Huff. This is a fascinating look at the recruiting process right now as we enter that final stretch. It's Bama, it's Georgia, it's Notre Dame, LSU, and Ohio State rounding out the top five. What are you going to be looking for as we make that sprint towards the finish line?
Well, first is going to be, can anybody catch Alabama? That's going to be the big question. Georgia's obviously in a position where they may be able to catch them with some of the guys that they brought in this weekend for official visits, some of the guys that came in for unofficial visits. Maybe landing some of those guys could turn the tide, no pun intended, towards Georgia. The other thing I'm going to be looking at is, are we going to see a outlier, if you will, a Texas A&M type of team from a year ago that isn't used to being in the top 2 or 3, make a late surge, and end up kind of being that new kid on the block with the top class? Will we find a school like that? Could that be a school like a Tennessee that's had some success on the field this year, has had some good success off the field from a recruiting standpoint, obviously getting Nico Iamaleava? Can there be a Texas A&M like third party, a third school that's kind of a surprise that we're not used to seeing pushing Alabama and Georgia? Or is it going to be status quo like most years have been?
Well, I think if there's one team that does have a chance to do it, it's probably LSU. If you're looking for a dark horse to finish number one, and why LSU? I mean, they got some bullets out there, some big fish out there. I think it starts with one of our favorite prospects, Nicholas Harbor. I mean, we're still trying to figure out where he's going. He's been linked to South Carolina. He's been linked to Michigan. But when we're talking about these schools in the top five, Harbor, it's really just LSU he's kind of considering. So that's one big fish. And then I think there's some more out there. I mean, LSU just took down Nick Saban in Alabama. You would assume Brian Kelly's going to use that to his advantage on the recruiting trail. Huff, you said it with Georgia. I was playing with the class calculator. I don't really know how anyone catches Alabama, who's sitting at, I think it's 310 points, but there is an avenue for the Bulldogs, and it starts by flipping two of Bama's top commits, Justice Haynes, the running back right there in the Atlanta Metro, and then his good friend Caleb Downs, the 5-star safety. Both those guys were between the hedges, on hand to watch Georgia dismantle number one ranked Tennessee, and just trading some texts with some guys inside that building. It seems like they felt like they made up some ground. So interested to see how that plays out, especially, if Alabama, they stumble down the stretch and Georgia has an opportunity to repeat in the college football playoff.
With Georgia, as you look at the success they've had at the tight end position, and specifically on the West Coast, with a guy like Brock Bowers, with a guy like Darnell Washington, well, who do they bring in this weekend for an official visit? His last official visit, Stanford, which has kind of been the crown jewel program of tight ends on the West Coast for the last decade plus. Walker Lyons takes his 5th and final official visit 4 months after he commits to Stanford. Now, he would sign this class, wouldn't enroll until the 2024 class. They're not out of the mix for a guy like a Deuce Robinson, who's the top-ranked tight end in the country. So that national appeal that Georgia has with a guy like a Brock Bowers, with a guy like a Keely Ringo, West Coast guys, it's not just the Southern guys that Georgia has a chance to flip and make compelling cases for. It's now that national reach. We saw it a few years ago when they got Kendall Milton, they got Darnell Washington. Obviously, it continued with Keely Ringo, then Brock Bowers. But now there's some West Coast guys that are starting to feel the dogs. And now you look at it not just from a Southern standpoint, but a West Coast standpoint. That's the kind of momentum that Kirby Smart was hoping this weekend would build for them. So you're right, Andrew, that's the kind of school that makes this case that Alabama may not be as secure at that number one spot as you'd think. Georgia is starting to really get things picking up.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Deuce Robinson. There's considerable buzz there now that Georgia has at least pulled even with USC for the number one tight end in this 2023 class. I did want to touch on some other players that could potentially tilt the scales. Damon Wilson, Keon Keeley, Mateo Uiagalelei, Desmond Ricks, who just reclassified from the 2024 class, and with Cormani McClain off the board, becomes perhaps the most coveted defensive back in this class. There's a lot here, Andrew, remaining for some of these top schools to make a push for.
Well, it's crazy. You think about Nick Saban in Alabama, he's 71 now. And I've been kind of marinating on this theory. We've seen some of these big recruitments get wild in the 11th hour with announcements. For example, we thought Cormani McClain was going to Florida. All of a sudden, he's at Miami. And let's be real, we're in the name, image, likeness era. But it seems like Bama hasn't been I don't know, involved in too many of those. Maybe they bowed out. And my working theory here is, hey, maybe Nick Saban is waiting until when it really matters, when we get into December. You mentioned Desmond Ricks. Ricks, the 5-star corner that reclassifies from 2024 to 2023. He spends this past weekend in Baton Rouge. Obviously, he saw an instant classic there. Steve Wiltfong, our colleague, our buddy, he fires in an LSU crystal ball pick. And Ricks could very well end up there. But what happens when he takes his official visit to Bama in December and he sits down with Nick Saban and Alabama? They go through what they can offer via NIL. I think, you also got Keon Keeley out there. There's a Lawson Lucky, tight end committed to Georgia. He's in play. Caden Proctor, I was reading, the Iowa commit 5-star tackle. He has said in the past he wants to get back to Tuscaloosa. So I just think, maybe we don't know how good this Bama class is. It's sitting at 310 points now, but this thing could challenge what Texas A&M did last year. So I think that's something you got to consider. And when we think big picture in the race for number one.
When you look back, historically, you look at a school like a USC under Pete Carroll. Mac Brown used to make his points getting the junior day, back when junior days were still a thing, getting so much of his class done. Meanwhile, USC would always kind of hover in January and February when they would get out on the roads, do those in-home visits. All of a sudden, USC's class would rise from maybe the 15th spot to the top 3. And that's the thing we've seen with Alabama historically. It's why they're always a top 2 or 3 class recruiting-wise. They seem to do their heavy lifting really from the time the SEC championship game is played until the early signing period is done. And then they get a few more splashes come February. Now they're probably not going to be playing in the SEC championship game. Great. If you're the SEC, that gives Nick Saban one more week to get out on the road, do in-home visits, and maybe close better than they did a year ago, maybe better than they have in recent years. So if anything, we're seeing that now with Alabama, the luster is not off that program. Maybe they're not going to play for a playoff spot this year, but the luster has not left anything. They're the top class in the country. Nick Saban is still recruiting at a high level like he's a 35-year-old. You mentioned he was 71. He doesn't recruit like he's 71. He recruits like a guy who's young and energetic and has no plans to leave anytime soon. So what we're doing here is we're seeing Bama now get a little bit more hungry. We saw it after the 2019 season when they lost to LSU, then they lost to Auburn, and then they beat the heck out of everybody the next year. But it started with that recruiting class in that 2019 to 2020 cycle. Now you're poking the bear again from a recruiting standpoint, and Nick Saban knows he's got to get a couple of weapons, couple of guys at key positions where they've always had that talent to keep this class not just number one, but to get them back into the playoff. I don't think America really wants to see what a hungry, angry Nick Saban looks like on the recruiting trail.
Never count out Nick Saban, as the Alabama Crimson Tide are setting the pace right now in the 2023 class rankings. Thanks so much, Brandon and Andrew. You can follow all their work over at 247sports.com.